Hey everybody, good afternoon, good evening. It is awesome to be coming to talk with you again about this idea of multivariate analysis today. So we know in organizations, right, that variables can affect other variables in interesting kinds of ways, and that oftentimes it's not just one thing that we might have that would influence the outcome of something. I mean, take for example the idea of job satisfaction or turnover or employee engagement. Think of all the many things that might affect somebody's level of engagement or their level of job satisfaction or their desire to leave that company. Taking a kind of a unidimensional or a one variable approach can really kind of leave us out on the cold in terms of understanding what are really the drivers here that we need to know and understand, which is where multivariate analysis really comes in. So if we pick up from here and we understand multivariate analysis as a way to really get at what are those different variables that affect things like job satisfaction and engagement and turnover, we can really kind of dive in. And just kind of as a reminder of how we set this question up, we looked at multivariate analysis through these two variables and really kind of setting up our question and our hypothesis through these two variables. So we have an independent variable and a dependent variable here. And the independent variable can be anything that we might think or hypothesize that might influence job satisfaction. We'll just take job satisfaction as our dependent variable for the sake of this particular example. And if I was to ask you, well, where would we get information about how, what do we think actually affects job satisfaction? Well, we might say, well, we would go back into the literature. We would go back and we would read some of the peer-reviewed literature about job satisfaction, and we know that researchers have done a lot of really great work around the idea of job satisfaction. So we would go back and we would review that, and we would see, well, what are the variables that the research would suggest actually influence job satisfaction? And then let's take this even further. Let's say that you work for a company that is losing a lot of money every year because they feel like job satisfaction is particularly low within their company. And let's say that it's if there was a money amount that was put on this problem, let's say it was worth $1 million to increase job satisfaction over the course of the next 12 months. We would want to be pretty sure about what that independent variable was, right? Or perhaps what those independent variables are. So maybe it's not just one thing, but it's actually four things. And we're going to be studying this in the context of our organization. We know that there's a $1 million loss here that's at stake. And so we would go back into the literature and we would identify all of those variables that we think really drive the idea of job satisfaction. This is called a multivariate analysis versus a univariate analysis because there's more than one variable that actually shares the variance here. And the variance is what is actually explaining what's going on in the dependent variable. So we have set up our multivariate problem here, and there are four different independent variables. And there could be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, but for the sake of our example, we're going to set up 4. And you and I can make a list about what are all the things that we think really drive job satisfaction in a company. We might say things like pay for performance, as we mentioned before, or satisfaction with supervisor, or opportunities for growth and learning within my job and organization. And we could test all of those things. And so we would go out, we would find ways, validated and reliable ways to measure those things, and we perhaps would send out a survey and we would get some information back, right? Well, how would we actually go about testing some of that? Well, the statistical tool for analysis here is called multiple regression or multivariate analysis. There are a couple different ways in which we can really kind of slice the pie here. Now, what we're getting ready to talk about is not something that you need to know precisely how to do. Those are the kinds of things that you would learn when you get into advanced statistics classes or even into doctoral level classes. But what I do want you to know is how you would do this if you needed to do this, and perhaps what questions you might ask. So let's say we were doing some kind of a multivariate analysis here, and we had set up, this problem here. How would we go about understanding it? Well, the first way we might do that is through multiple regression. And there are 3 kinds of multiple regression: simultaneous entry, stepwise, and hierarchical. A simultaneous entry would throw all 4 of those variables in at the same time into the model and say, okay, well, what comes out here is as statistically significant. Stepwise would take one of those variables and they kind of mine those data, and we would enter those variables at different points in time, and we would do it both forward perhaps and backward to see if we could explain as much of the outcome or the dependent variable as we possibly can. And hierarchical is really grounded in theory. So we would go back to the literature and we would say, well, what are the things that we would expect would explain most of the variance in the outcome variable? And think about variance as all of the different ways that someone can explain the behavior, right? So hierarchical regression is really theory based. Then there may also be things that are dichotomous in nature. So, for example, things that are categorical, so male and female. We might think that maybe gender drives job satisfaction, that maybe men or women actually experience higher job satisfaction just as a function of their gender. A logistic regression would help us understand that because it specifically looks at dichotomous or categorical kinds of variables. And then there's something called a MANOVA, which really splits out variables by categorical differences, and it splits them out if we wanted to look at particular ranges in age or particular ranges in gender or location. We can look at all those things through a MANOVA. So if we were going to do some multivariate analysis, there's multiple regression, logistic regression, and MANOVA analysis. So again, this is not something you need to know how to do. There's not going to be any formulas that you're going to see here, but I would want you to know that these things are here and how you might go about looking at multivariate analysis versus a univariate analysis. If we move this idea forward, the text makes a really good argument about, well, does this actually matter? So let's say that we enter all four of those variables into a simultaneous regression model, and we find some significance, right? But did we actually really find anything? So statistical significance is telling us, well, there is a relationship here, and the relationship is probably not due to chance. But actually, did we find anything? Well, let's take a look at this. So let's say that our correlation tells us that there's a relation between orientation programs and job satisfaction. So when people go through an orientation program, when they move into it or they come into an organization, there's a 0.80 relationship between job satisfaction, right? And we know that correlation varies between negative 1.0 and positive 1.0, and the closer that Pearson product moment correlation coefficient is to 1, the stronger the relationship is. The closer it is to 0, the weaker that relationship is. Well, if we wanted to know, is that relationship actually mean anything, we would look at effect size. And in this case, we might look at R squared. And what this does is it's the issue of significance doesn't really tell us whether we should spend any money on it. So a relationship of 0.80 really doesn't tell us anything about, does this actually make a meaningful difference? But effect size does. And effect size really tells us whether or not we get our bang for our buck. If we were to take a look at this example, this is an intent to turnover model. This is a paragraph that's actually taken from a research article. And here, if we were to break down what we see here, there are a couple of things going on. We would see that someone tested some kind of an intention to turnover model. And it looks like they used a hierarchical regression modeling technique because they mentioned that there's a first block here. So it says testing the intention to turnover model. In the first block, which means the first level of entry, there must have been some kind of theory that they were going from. 2 of the psychological climate subscales, self-expression and challenge. Now notice something here. Let's pause here for a second. We see that small b, that's a beta weight, and we see it's negative 0.31, comma, p is less than 0.01. What that tells us is that this is a statistically significant relationship. So there's a statistically significant relationship between self-expression and intent to turnover, as well as challenge. That beta weight, that b there, equals 0.16, and again we have p is less than 0.01. Again, that tells us that it's statistically significant. Now notice that we have different signs here. So the more people feel like they're able to self-express at their work, the less likely they are to turn over. There's a negative relationship there. The more that they feel like they have a challenge in their work, the more likely they are. So those are in opposite directions, which is kind of interesting. And then we have and support for professional growth. Again, we have that beta weight there, negative 0.22. P is greater than 0.01. So we see that all 3 of these has some kind of statistical significance to them. It's pretty interesting. But does it really mean anything? Well, what that does, the next sentence kind of tells us. It says, contributed unique variance to the prediction of the intent to turnover model And here we see in parentheses that that delta sign means adjusted. And then we see r squared equals 0.42, comma, p is greater or is less than 0.01. So what that's telling us is that for those three variables, self-expression, challenge, and support for professional growth, 42% of the 100% of variance that could be explained, 42% of the variance is actually explained in intent to turnover model. So, self-expression, challenge, and support for growth, they do share a relationship, but they also share a large effect size. If we drop down and we read a sentence 2 lines below that, says overall, the regression model explained 42% of the variance for the intent to turnover model, large effect size. So, let's say that I was going to want to affect turnover in my company. Well, if this sample was applicable to my company, there are 3 things that I might focus on: self-expression, challenge, and support for professional growth. It seems like almost 50% of the variance, a little under 50% of the variance, can actually be explained in the dependent variable here. So those 3 independent variables explain a significant amount of variance in the outcome, or the dependent variable. Pretty interesting. If we were to move forward, this is what a table for that might look like. Now, this is a different dependent variable. This is a discretionary effort variable. And if we look down the side here, we see we're looking for things that have stars next to them. So supportive management has 2 stars, contribution has 2 stars, and challenge has 2 stars. And there's no negative signs here, so we know that the relationship between those variables is positive. So the more supportive a manager is, the more somebody feels like they contribute to their work, and the more appropriate levels of challenge they have in their work, they're more likely to give discretionary effort. Now, we see that R is, if we look down the R column, is 0.63. And just to the right of that, we see 0.38, which tells us that 38% of the variance in the model can be explained by these 3 variables alone: supportive management, contribution, and challenge. That's interesting for us. So not only do we know that there's a statistical relationship there, but that it explains the effect of these 3 variables on the dependent variable is actually quite large. So if I wanted to move the needle on discretionary effort, I would increase how my managers are supportive of my employees. I would make sure that my employees knew how they contributed to their overall job, and I would make sure that their jobs were appropriately challenging. We're just looking at 2 different ways to kind of understand this. Sometimes in a research article, you're going to see a paragraph like this, and sometimes you're going to see a table like this. And I just want you to see the examples of how that might fit. Now, again, it's not important for you to know how to do these things, but it is important for you to know how to read these things and understand, well, what does this actually mean? So remember that a statistical relationship between something actually doesn't mean it causes anything, or that it predicts, or that the relationship between those 2 variables is meaningful at all. What tells us what the magnitude of meaning is effect size. So if there's a relationship, think strength. If there is an effect size, think degree of magnitude. If we move that forward, and you have to ask, like, well, what's the point for all this, right? Well, each of these methods can be really helpful, and they have limitations that come along with their strengths. There is no one kind of magic way to look at any of this stuff, but it is important to know that sometimes vendors or third-party consulting companies are going to give you a lot of data that suggests that there's a relationship, but relationships don't actually indicate anything meaningful. We really are looking for effect size there. As an HR professional, you should know these things, and you should be able to recommend. I feel really strongly that if somebody's bringing data to you, you should be the person in the company that should know what to do with that information. You should be able to recommend something, or at least know where to go get the information you need. We need to be able to advise on research that affects our business units. Otherwise, we'll never have a seat at that table. When we have information that is valuable to the company in terms of how research can affect business units, and when we say research affects business units, think performance, think profitability. And things like reliability, validity, effect size, and directionality, they really matter. Remember, there were some positive and negative relationships that we looked at in our 2 examples previously. that directionality makes a big difference. So you should kind of know about what these words actually mean in practice. So to kind of wrap things up, a couple of things to keep in mind. Next week is actually spring break. It's hard to think about spring break right now because it's 4 degrees outside, but hopefully everybody has some plans to have some fun. And then the quantitative exercise is due after the break, and there's a podcast that'll be put up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of hours or days about that. So I would encourage you to check back for that and make sure that you have the most up-to-date information about that quantitative exercise. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to spend this time with you. Until next time.